Chapter 1. It was a snowy February night when a stranger got off the train at Bramblehurst railway station in the southern part of England. A large brimmed hat and long black coat covered him from head to toe, but they barely protected him from the biting wind and heavy snow that piled up on him and on the small black suitcase he was carrying in his gloved hands. There were no carriages at the station, and the man was forced to struggle through the storm on foot for several hours to reach his destination, the small village of Ipping. Flinging open the door of the Coach and Horses Inn, the exhausted stranger staggered inside, more dead than alive. Keeping his head down on his chest, the man gasped, "A room and a fire, and hurry, please." "I'm Mrs. Hall, the innkeeper here," said a woman coming out from behind the bar. "If you'll just follow me upstairs, sir, I'll show you to a room." The stranger kept his back to Mrs. Hall as they negotiated a price for his room and meals. Then, after lighting a fire in the fireplace for the man, Mrs. Hall went downstairs to prepare a meal for him. By the time she returned with a tray of hot food, the fire was burning brightly, making the room warm and comfortable. The stranger, however, still wore his coat, hat, and gloves as he stood at the window, staring out at the storm. "The snow from your coat and hat is melting onto my carpet, sir," said Mrs. Hall. "May I take them and dry them in the kitchen for you?" "No," snapped the man, finally turning to face her. "I prefer to keep them on." At that moment, Mrs. Hall got her first real look at the man. Below the wide brim of the hat were big blue glasses that wrapped around the front and sides of his eyes. A bushy beard and sideburns came down over his coat collar, completely hiding his cheeks and chin. "Very well," she said, and left the room. Upon her return to the kitchen, she discovered that she had forgotten the mustard for the man's meal, so she put it on a tray and went back upstairs with it. She knocked once, then immediately opened the door. Her sudden appearance surprised the man, and all she saw was a flash of white as he ducked under the table. "I suppose I can take these now, sir?" she asked, pointing to the overcoat and hat on a chair in front of the fire. "The coat, yes, but leave the hat," came a muffled voice as the man sat up. Mrs. Hall gaped in shock at the sight before her. Behind the blue glasses were masses of white bandages wrapped around the man's head. Only a shiny pink nose and thick patches of black hair stuck out between the bandages. Just as strange were his hands, still wearing gloves, and they held a large napkin over the lower part of his face, completely covering his mouth and jaw. His dark brown dressing gown had its high collar turned up, and a scarf knotted at the front. "Leave the hat," repeated the man firmly. Yes, sir," stammered the woman as she slowly began to recover from her shock. I didn't realize, sir, that... Thank you, madam, that will be all." Mrs. Hall picked up his coat and hurried out of the room, shivering as she closed the door behind her. "The poor soul's had an accident, or an operation, or something," she muttered to herself. "What a scare those bandages gave me. And he must have hurt his mouth, too, the way he was talking through that napkin. Oh, the poor soul." Once the stranger had finished his meal, he settled himself in an armchair in front of the fire and lit his pipe. Knowing that Mrs. Hall would be returning to pick up the tray, he wrapped the scarf loosely around the lower part of his face, leaving room for the stem of the pipe to reach his lips. When the woman knocked and entered a while later, she found that the food and drink and warmth had changed the stranger's mood as he spoke to her more politely than before. "I have some luggage at Bramblehurst Station, Mrs. Hall. How can I have it brought here?" "My husband will be back later tonight with our horse and cart. He can get it for you tomorrow morning." "Isn't there anyone who can go tonight?" "Not and risk an accident on the steep roads in this snow. You surely know what accidents can..." "Yes, I do. I, too, had an accident. It left my eyes weak, so I must stay in darkness and wear these glasses most days." "What kind of accident were..." "That is not important, Mrs. Hall. All I can tell you is I'm a scientist working on a very crucial experiment. My baggage contains all my instruments, my chemicals, and my notebooks. I need to get to my work without any further delay, but if tomorrow's the earliest I can get it, I suppose that will have to do. Good night, madam." Mrs. Hull left the room, muttering to herself, "Sensitive about accidents, ain't he?" She couldn't wait to get back down to the bar to give her customers a vivid description of her mysterious guest. Most of the men showed sympathy for the stranger because of his accident. Except, of course, for Teddy Henfrey, the village clockmaker. "Accident, ha!" snapped Teddy. "He's got to be hiding out from the police, wrapping himself up in all those bandages has to be the best way to hide." "And who's hiding behind what bandages?" came a voice at the door to the inn. "The stranger your wife just rented a room to, Mr. Hull," said Teddy. "I'd take a good look at his luggage when you bring it in from the station tomorrow." "You mind your own business, Teddy," snapped Mrs. Hull. "And you too, Hull. This is my inn, and I'll run it as I see fit." But in spite of her strong words, Mrs. Hull had to admit to herself that she, too, was quite suspicious about the stranger. And those suspicions filled her dreams that night with huge black eyes and white turnip heads at the end of long necks, heads that were chasing her through the streets of the village.